I stared at the nearly empty balance on my banking app, confusion washing over me. Where's my money? I asked, my voice filled with disbelief. My chest tightened as I scrolled through the transactions once again, hoping I'd somehow missed something, but there was no mistake. Nearly $10,000, money I had worked for every summer since high school, was gone. Edward, my stepfather, sat across from me at the kitchen table, casually flipping through the mail without sparing me a glance. "Relax, Clarice. It's not gone," he said, his tone annoyingly nonchalant. "I moved it into a better account for you. Higher interest and all that." I blinked, trying to make sense of his words. "You moved it? Without telling me?" He finally looked up, his face displaying the kind of calm, condescending expression that made my blood boil. "You'll thank me later. It's earning more that way." Something about his words didn't sit right with me. "What account?" I demanded, my voice becoming sharper. "Show me." Edward waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, it's tied up in some obligations right now," he said, his words dripping with indifference. "But don't worry, it's being put to good use." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My name is Clarice, and for as long as I could remember, I had been saving for my future. Since I was 16, I worked every summer, sometimes juggling 2 jobs, one at a coffee shop in the mornings and another at an ice cream stand in the evenings. I passed on vacations with friends, skipped out on new clothes, and ate more ramen than I care to admit, all so I could build my savings. That money wasn't just a sum in my bank account, it was supposed to be my ticket to freedom. I didn't know if I'd use it for college, a down payment on my own place, or maybe even a dream trip to Europe, but it was mine, and I had earned every cent of it. Edward and my mom, Margaret, always dismissed my efforts, brushing off my plans with comments like, "You're young, you have time to figure it out." But I never expected them to just take my money, until now. The truth finally came out that evening after I relentlessly pestered Edward. I cornered Margaret in the living room. "Where's my money, Mom?" I demanded, my voice shaking with frustration. "Edward says he moved it into some account, but he won't tell me where." Margaret hesitated, glancing nervously toward the kitchen where Edward was preparing himself a drink. "Look, Clarice," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "it's not as bad as you think." "That's not an answer," I snapped. "What did you do with it?" Her face stiffened, and I knew immediately that whatever she was about to say would send me into a rage. "We used it to pay for Emily's tuition," she admitted, her voice filled with unease. "Emily?" I repeated, stunned. "Your stepdaughter?" "You used my money to pay for her college?" Margaret defended herself. "She needed it, Clarice. Her financial aid didn't come through, and she was at risk of losing her spot." "What were we supposed to do? Let her drop out?" "Yes," I screamed, unable to contain my anger. "She's not my responsibility." "That money was mine. How could you think this was okay?" Edward appeared in the doorway, holding his drink like it was some kind of prop in a performance. "You're young," he said with a smirk, repeating Margaret's favorite excuse. "You can always earn it back." Emily didn't have that kind of time. The room felt like it was spinning as their words sank in. All those sleepless nights, the blisters on my hands from working double shifts, every penny I'd saved, it had all been for nothing. They had taken what was mine and used it to bail out Emily, who, as far as I could tell, had never worked a day in her life. "I want it back," I said, my voice cold and unwavering. "Every cent." Edward snorted and took a sip of his drink. "You're being dramatic, Clarice. It's already spent. What do you expect us to do, pull it out of thin air?" "I don't care how you do it," I fired back, my anger rising again. "Figure it out." Margaret sighed, rubbing her temples as though I were the unreasonable one. "Clarice, please," she said softly. "You're acting like we robbed you. We're family. Sometimes sacrifices have to be made." "Sacrifices?" I yelled, my voice rising in frustration. "I made sacrifices. I worked for that money. Emily didn't sacrifice anything. You stole it and gave it to her like it was yours to give." That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, replaying the conversation in my mind, each word from Edward and Margaret stoking my anger. By morning, I had made up my mind. I called Danny first. I need help, I said, my voice shaking as I recounted everything that had happened. Her outrage was instant. They did what? She exclaimed. Clarice, that's theft. You need to call a lawyer. The second call I made was to a law firm Danny recommended. The lawyer who answered listened patiently as I laid out the entire situation, from Edward's manipulative charm to Margaret's excuses. After a long pause, the lawyer spoke. This is a clear case of unauthorized use of funds. We can definitely pursue legal action, but it will require some documentation from you. Do you have access to the account statements? Yes, I said firmly. I'll send everything. As I hung up, a sense of calm washed over me. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. Edward and Margaret believed they could exploit me due to my youth, our family connection, and their assumption that I wouldn't stand up for myself. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. The following days were filled with a chaotic mix of phone calls, emails, and emotions running high. One evening, Danny sat with me, helping me sort through old bank statements to gather evidence for the lawyer. I can't believe they had the nerve to take it, Danny said, shaking her head as she pointed out a suspicious transfer. Who does that? And for Emily of all people, doesn't she already get everything handed to her? I nodded, biting the inside of my cheek to keep myself from snapping the pen in my hand. She's never had to work for anything, and now they're making it seem like I'm the selfish one for wanting my money back. Danny looked at me with conviction. You're doing the right thing. They want you to feel guilty, but you owe them nothing. This is theft, plain and simple. The lawyer, Rebecca, was on the same page. At our first official meeting, she reviewed the documents I had gathered, nodding in approval. This is more than enough to support your case, she said. Since Edward transferred money from your account without permission, it qualifies as unauthorized use of funds. We'll start by sending a demand letter. I leaned forward, eager to understand the next steps. And if they ignore it? Rebecca's response was simple but firm. Then we escalate. Trust me, most people respond when the legal system is involved. They're probably already panicking. The idea of Edward and Margaret scrambling to cover their tracks gave me a dark sense of satisfaction. For years, they'd treated me as insignificant, always prioritizing Emily. Now, they would have to face the consequences of their actions. The demand letter was delivered to their home 3 days later. I imagine the scene unfolding, Edward tearing open the envelope, his smug smile disappearing as he read. Margaret pacing nervously in the kitchen, muttering about ungrateful children. And Emily, completely oblivious, lounging in her dorm room with no idea what was happening. It didn't take long for the fallout to reach me. My phone buzzed late that evening, with Edward's name flashing on the screen. I considered ignoring it but gave in to my curiosity and answered. What is this, Clarice? He barked as soon as I picked up. You sent a lawyer after us? I took a steady breath, keeping my voice calm. Yes, I did. You stole my money, Edward. I'm holding you accountable. Stole? He repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. We're family. It was a loan. No, it wasn't, I replied sharply. You didn't ask me. You didn't even tell me. You just took it. Margaret's voice interrupted from the background. Clarice, you're being ridiculous. We did this for Emily. She needed help. And I didn't? I shot back. Do you have any idea how hard I worked for that money? How much I sacrificed to save it? You had no right. Edward scoffed. You're young. You can earn it back. This is a waste of everyone's time. I stood my ground. I guess we'll let the courts decide that, I said before hanging up. Their defiance only strengthened my determination. The next day, Rebecca filed the formal complaint, citing unauthorized use of funds and breach of trust. This should get their attention, she said, emailing me the court documents. If they refuse to repay the full amount, we'll move forward with legal proceedings. As word of the situation spread, extended family began reaching out. Margaret had evidently painted herself and Edward as selfless parents who made a difficult choice for the good of the family while portraying me as unreasonable. But I wasn't about to let their false narrative go unchallenged. During a heated phone call, my aunt attempted to intervene. Clarice, you have to see it from their side, she said. They were just trying to help Emily. Isn't that what family does? Family doesn't steal from each other, I replied coldly. They could have asked me. Instead, they took what they wanted and assumed I wouldn't fight back. There was a pause on the other end before she muttered, "Well, I suppose you have a point." Meanwhile, Danny became my constant support. She stayed up late with me, helping me sort through Rebecca's updates and reminding me to stay focused. "I know it's exhausting," she said one night as we sat together surrounded by piles of paperwork, "but you're almost there." They're already cracking under the pressure. Danny wasn't wrong. Margaret had begun sending me long, rambling texts, alternating between guilt-tripping and begging for forgiveness. One message read, "We didn't mean to hurt you. Can't we just move on from this?" Another said, "Why are you dragging us through this? Emily's education is important. Don't you want her to succeed?" Edward, on the other hand, remained firm in his arrogance. When Rebecca contacted him for a statement, he refused to cooperate, insisting that the money was family property and I had no claim to it. Their refusal to acknowledge their wrongdoing only strengthened my resolve to pursue this to the end. When I told Rebecca what had happened, she wasted no time in responding. "Let him dig his own grave," she said, unimpressed. "The courts aren't going to sympathize with someone who tries to justify theft as a family issue." The real turning point came when Emily finally discovered the truth. She called me unexpectedly, her tone more annoyed than remorseful. "Why are you making such a big deal out of this?" she demanded. "It's not like you needed the money right away. Do you even hear yourself?" I snapped back. "That money wasn't yours, it wasn't Edward's, and it wasn't Margaret's. It was mine. And now, you're benefiting from something that was taken from me." Her response was a frustrated sigh. "What do you want me to do about it?" "Nothing," I replied. "I want them to do something about it. And trust me, they will." By the time the court date rolled around, Edward and Margaret were visibly falling apart. Rebecca had put together a strong case, and the pressure of accumulating legal fees, paired with the threat of a formal judgment, finally pushed them to ask about a settlement. "We'll pay you back," Edward muttered begrudgingly during the mediation. "But this is ridiculous, Clarice. You're tearing the family apart over a misunderstanding." "No," I corrected him sharply. "You tore the family apart the moment you decided my hard work didn't matter. This is me fixing it." The mediation room was cold and impersonal, a place designed for no illusions or distractions. Edward sat across from me with his arms crossed, his face an impassive mask of frustration. Beside him, Margaret avoided my gaze, nervously wringing her hands. Rebecca sat next to me, confident and calm as she flipped through a stack of documents detailing their betrayal. The mediator, a composed woman in her mid-40s, addressed the room with a firm, yet neutral, tone. "We're here to resolve the dispute between Clarice and Edward and Margaret Reynolds concerning the unauthorized transfer of $10,000 from Clarice's account. Both parties will have the opportunity to present their sides, and we'll work towards a resolution that satisfies both parties." Edward leaned forward, his tone carefully controlled but edged with tension. "Let me start by saying this is all a huge misunderstanding. We didn't steal anything. We moved the money to help our other daughter, Emily, with her tuition. Clarice is young. She has plenty of time to save more." Rebecca didn't flinch. "You transferred $10,000 from her account without her permission," she interjected, her voice slicing through his explanation. "That's not a misunderstanding, that's theft." Edward's smirk was there, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's family money. We're all part of the same household. I didn't think it was necessary to ask for permission." "You didn't think it was necessary?" Rebecca repeated, her tone incredulous. "Even though the account was in Clarice's name and she was the only one contributing to it?" Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice trembling. "We didn't mean to hurt her. We just thought," she trailed off, unsure of what to say next. "That she wouldn't notice? That she wouldn't care?" I interrupted, my voice icy. "You thought you could take what I worked for and call it a family decision? That's not how this works." The mediator raised her hand, signaling for the conversation to stop. "Let's focus on the facts," she said, her voice even but commanding. Clarice, your position is that the $10,000 was yours, earned through your work, and transferred without your consent. Is that correct? Yes, I replied, my gaze unwavering. It was my money, saved up over years of hard work. I never agreed to any of this. And Edward, the mediator continued, you claim the transfer was made with good intentions, to help your other daughter? That's correct, Edward said, his voice sharp, but it lacked its earlier confidence. It wasn't malicious. We were just trying to help Emily. Then why didn't you ask me first? I fired back. Why did you lie and say it was going into a higher interest account? Edward opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, he seemed genuinely trapped. Rebecca took control, sliding a document across the table. This is the transaction record showing the unauthorized transfer, she said, her voice unwavering. It clearly shows that Edward accessed the account without Clarice's knowledge or consent. We also have screenshots of text messages where he admits to using the funds for Emily's tuition. There's no ambiguity here. As the mediator reviewed the evidence, Margaret turned pale, her earlier bravado dissolving. Edward's jaw clenched, and his earlier cockiness began to fade. We didn't think it would be such a big deal, he muttered under his breath, almost as if to himself. It's a big deal, I said, my voice steady but firm. You didn't just take money. You took my trust. And now, instead of taking responsibility for what you did, you're trying to justify it. The mediator placed the document down and folded her hands. Edward, Margaret, based on the evidence presented, it is clear that the funds were transferred without Clarice's consent. While I understand your intentions, your actions violated her financial autonomy. The recommendation is for full repayment, including any associated legal fees incurred by Clarice. Margaret let out a quiet gasp, but Edward remained motionless, his expression a perfect mask of barely contained rage. How are we supposed to come up with that kind of money? He demanded, his voice strained. That's not my problem, I replied coldly. Figure it out, just as I figured out how to save it in the first place. A tense silence followed, until the mediator broke it again. If you agree to the repayment terms, we can settle this today. If not, Clarice has the option of pursuing a civil lawsuit, which may lead to further financial consequences. Edward let out a sharp exhale, his eyes narrowing as he glared at me, as though I were the one at fault. Fine, he muttered through clenched teeth. We'll pay her back. The mediator nodded and slid the settlement agreement toward us. Please review and sign. As they scribbled their signatures, Margaret lifted her gaze toward me, her eyes a mix of anger and sadness. We never wanted it to come to this, she said quietly. It didn't have to, I responded, locking eyes with her. You made the decision to take what wasn't yours. I'm just making sure you face the consequences. Walking out of that room, I was overwhelmed with a jumble of emotions, relief, a sense of vindication, and a deep, lingering sadness for what had been permanently broken. Rebecca placed a comforting hand on my shoulder as we made our way to the elevator. You handled that perfectly, she said. They're lucky you didn't demand more. They'll pay for what they did, I replied, my voice steady. That's all I wanted. But even as I said those words, I knew it wasn't really about the money. It was about proving to myself that I wouldn't let anyone, not even my family, treat me as if I didn't matter. 2 weeks later, the first payment appeared in my account, part of the total owed as outlined in the settlement. It wasn't the full $10,000 yet, but seeing even a portion of it returned felt like a small victory. For the first time in weeks, I felt a little lighter. It wasn't just the money, it was the knowledge that I had stood my ground. The day after the transfer, Margaret called. This time, her voice was softer, almost apologetic. Clarice, she began, hesitating. We've started making the payments. I hope this means we can start moving on. I paused before responding, carefully choosing my words. Moving on isn't just about paying me back, I said. It's about understanding what you did and why it was wrong. We never meant to hurt you, she said quickly. We were just trying to help Emily. You keep saying that, I replied calmly. But you didn't ask. You didn't consider how it would affect me. That's what hurts the most. She sighed deeply, and for a moment, I thought she might finally take responsibility. But then she said, "You're young, Clarice. You have your whole life ahead of you to rebuild. Can't we just put this behind us?" I clenched my jaw, feeling my frustration rise. This isn't about being young or old, Mom. It's about respect. And if you can't understand that, maybe we're not ready to move on. There was silence on the other end. Later that evening, Danny came over with a bottle of wine to celebrate the first payment. "To holding people accountable," she said, raising her glass with a grin. "To never letting anyone take advantage of me again," I replied, clinking my glass against hers. As we chatted, I realized just how much this experience had transformed me. For years, I had allowed Margaret and Edward's dismissive attitudes to wear me down, convincing myself that standing up to them wasn't worth the trouble. But now I understood better. Setting boundaries didn't make me selfish, it made me strong. A few weeks later, I received a message from Emily. It was short, awkward, and contained a half-hearted apology for her role in everything. "I didn't know they were using your money," she wrote. "I'm sorry if I'd benefited from it." I didn't feel the need to reply. Whether she was aware or not didn't change the fact that she had been complicit in a system that prioritized her needs over mine. Maybe forgiveness would come one day, but not yet. Edward, predictably, stayed silent. He made the payments on time but didn't reach out. His pride likely kept him from addressing the situation any further. That suited me just fine. I wasn't interested in repairing a relationship with someone who had seen me as little more than an exploitable resource. As the payments continued, I started to feel a sense of relief. I adjusted my budget, reopened my savings account, and set new goals for the future. The betrayal still hurt, but it no longer consumed me. Instead, it fueled me, serving as a reminder of my own strength and the importance of protecting what I had worked so hard for. Eventually, the full amount was paid off, and when the final payment arrived in my account, I stared at the total balance with a sense of pride and relief. My savings were whole again, not just the money I had worked so hard for, but the validation that came with reclaiming what was rightfully mine. It felt like the beginning of a fresh start, a chapter where I finally had control over my own destiny. That evening, I celebrated in my own quiet way. There were no grand parties, no expensive splurges, just a simple toast in the peaceful setting of my apartment. I had rebuilt everything they had tried to take from me, and the lessons I learned along the way were far more valuable than any amount of money. Not long after the last payment was made, Margaret called once again. This time, her tone was calm, almost tentative. "Clarice," she started, "I know we've had our differences, but I hope we can move on from here." I responded with a steady voice, yet firm. "Moving on means respecting me," I said. "It's not just about my money. It's about my decisions, my boundaries, and my independence. If you can't honor that, then there's nothing to move forward to." There was a silence on her end, long enough for me to wonder if my words had finally sunk in. "I'll try," she replied softly. "I really will." It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was a start. I didn't immediately offer forgiveness. Rebuilding trust would take time. Yet, there was a small glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could repair our relationship one day. For now, my focus remained on myself. A few weeks later, Danny and I sat together on my apartment's balcony, sipping wine as we watched the sun dip below the horizon. She raised her glass and asked, "So, what's next for the incredible Clarice? Got any big plans?" I smiled, feeling a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced in months. "I'm not sure yet," I confessed. "Maybe it's time to go back to school, or perhaps I'll finally invest in something I've always wanted. Whatever I decide, though, it'll be on my terms." "To your terms," Danny toasted, clinking her glass against mine. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I reflected on the journey that had led me here. Edward and Margaret had underestimated me, believing I'd let their betrayal slide because of our family ties. But I had proven them wrong. I had stood up for myself, reclaimed what was mine, and emerged stronger in the process. The money in my bank account was more than just a figure. It was a testament to my resilience, my independence, and my unwavering ability to fight for what I deserved. Whatever the future held, I was ready. And this time, no one would take it from me.